So I just clicked record so that people who cannot join us tonight can watch the recording. But welcome to tonight's webinar. It's going to focus on physiology lab testing, blood panels, and fusing proactive healthcare with endurance performance. And as I mentioned right before we started recording, the genesis of this call is largely because working triathlete, we recently moved our Nashville headquarters to a new facility containing a performance lab, and we have been friends with Transformat10n Lab for a while. I know Kurt Lockhart, the owner, he came and he spoke at a working triathlete camp last year, and athletes have gone to him for metabolic testing and other tests. But we joined forces more in a more focused manner recently, and we partnered with them to really elevate the health and performance of working triathletes and give everybody access to cutting edge metabolic testing, body composition testing, blood paneling, and even healthcare. And tonight, so Kurt is joining us with Transformat10n Lab, and I'll introduce him in a second. And also joining us is Dr. Jake DeVolder, and he is a doctor at he's currently a hospitalist, and he is heading up the Transformat10n Clinic. So first, let me introduce Kurt briefly, and then I'll introduce Dr. Jake. So Kurt, he grew up on a university research farm in central Iowa. The combination of spending a summer working in a corn insects lab and moving to Nashville to pursue college athletics at Vanderbilt, he was on the football team there. It solidified the fact that sports science was a lot more interesting to him than agronomy science. After college, he started a sports nutrition business, followed by the Transformat10n Lab in 2014. He holds certifications from the American College of Sports Medicine and International Society of Sports Nutrition, and he enjoys working with local Nashville clients and athletes and consulting for a regional sports nutrition company. And also on this call, as I mentioned, is Dr. Jake. So Jake is originally from a small Kansas town. He arrived in Nashville in July 2010 for medical school. He graduated from Vanderbilt with his MD and Master's of Education degrees in 2015. And then he stayed on at Vanderbilt to complete his residency training. Since 2018, he's been working as a hospitalist in our community, caring for sick patients in the hospital. And while he still considers it a privilege to connect with patients in this capacity, he's long wanted to shift to disease prevention and health promotion. And on that front, he's definitely excited to partner with Transformat10n Lab, and he's launching Transformat10n Clinic, and we'll chat about that. But to kick things off, I think it makes sense to turn to Kurt first, and Kurt can talk about Transformat10n Lab and the different performance tests and the services offered there.
Yeah, thanks, Conrad. We're excited to be with this group. If y'all remember, you guys were at the camp, I guess, last year out at Montgomery Bell. One of the best things about working with endurance athletes from a sports science side is really just the consistency. As a former strength and power athlete, we're kind of meatheads when it comes to the data. We don't really care. We're up sniffing ammonia and trying to set PR maxes and stuff like that. But endurance athletes, I love how they really take the data and apply it. So opportunity to work with this team is something we're really excited about. To give just a little backstory on the lab, like Conrad said, we started in 2014, providing what we felt like was missing at that time, which was just an accurate and accessible place for people to go and get assessments done, particularly in the body composition and metabolic space. Things have changed a lot since then. We moved into this new facility here recently, with Conrad and Working Triathlete headquarters. So we're really focused right now on sort of three big areas of testing. One of those areas is the body composition. area, which we use a DEXA scanning for that. So we're able to look at body composition, bone density, as well as for health and longevity purposes, visceral fat measurements. We also do resting metabolic rate assessments, so looking more at an individual's metabolism at rest, as well as like the fat to carb burn or their substrate utilization during that testing. And then the last one we do is the performance testing, or the VO2 max testing. And we've got some exciting things in the works there with Conrad and Working Triathlete, integrating. We've got all pieces are kind of coming together here from, looking at VO2 data. We have some muscle oxygen sensors, some lactate testing. So we're working to put together the most efficient protocol to assess, athletes' performance and zones, and help be a valuable resource for coaches and athletes.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of tests available that are useful. And so the lab is one piece of the puzzle, and we can dive into the details of there in a little bit, especially through the Q&A. I know a lot of athletes submitted questions, and I should say before we keep going, if anybody has any questions, feel free to jump in and ask any at any time, because we want to, give whatever information you want to hear to you. So obviously the Transformation Lab, the Performance Lab is going to be invaluable to working triathletes, powerful stuff. And turning to Dr. Jake, Jay, can you talk about the clinic and the Fusion 10 membership?
Yeah, thanks, Conrad. Thanks for having me on tonight. So like Conrad was saying, I've been a hospitalist in the community here for a few years now. And just between my training and now in my career, just sort of seeing the epidemic of kind of chronic disease, particularly lifestyle mediated diseases, have really been wanting to turn my attention more towards disease prevention, health promotion. And so have been trying to create something like this for a while. Was really excited when Kurt approached me about doing this in partnership with the Transformation Lab. So what I'm looking to do is with the Transformation Clinic is sort of more advanced disease and dysfunction screening, looking for really early signs of problems, not being okay with good enough, but really trying to optimize things, setting people on a good trajectory for longer term health. In our 30s, 40s, 50s, that's when we really kind of start to see the trajectories of our health kind of start to separate themselves out. So this is really kind of prime time for people to be identifying problems while they're still small, and while interventions can be really powerful. So just looking to do that. So got pretty thorough, comprehensive blood panels that I use, looking at cardiovascular risk, metabolic health, liver and kidney health, hormones, a pretty comprehensive panel that we then couple with the data that we get from the lab testing on Kurt's side, just to try to build a really comprehensive picture of where someone's at with their health, and then taking a pretty in-depth analysis of lifestyle factors. We're talking about activity levels, nutrition, sleep, stress, really any substance use, caffeine, even, and just trying to figure out, where we can make improvements to really overall improve and optimize health. So Kurt and I have been working together for about 18 months now, I think, trying to put this together. And so we now have our Fusion membership up in place. And so that's sort of an annual plan where over the course of a year, you can get 8 tests with Kurt spread across kind of those 3 modalities, the body comp, the VO2, and the resting metabolic rate, as well as a year of support with me. So kind of all of that comprehensive blood panel analysis, lifestyle factor assessments, and really just kind of drilling in on what we need to work on and how we're going to do that. And then you got me for that full year to really help move the needle on those interventions and troubleshoot and reassess progress and move forward.
So is it appropriate to think of, if an athlete wants to start a Fusion membership, to think of you sort of as their primary care doc, or how do they think about that?
Yeah, I think I sort of envision myself more as a consultant in this role. But to some degree, I would think it kind of depends on what each individual envisions that they need from a primary care doctor. I still am working full time as a hospitalist, so I'm doing this kind of in between evenings, weekends, over my lunch breaks, those sorts of things. So I'm not set up to do acute visits, sick visits, things like that. Some people are going to their primary care doctor for immunizations and things like that. I'm not set up to do all of those kinds of things. So if that's what you're envisioning, wanting and needing from a primary care doctor, you may want to keep a primary care doctor, or I may not be the right fit for you in that instance. But if there are aspects of what I do that are very much primary care, or what primary care ought to be, really looking at health promotion and disease prevention. So I think that is kind of sort of on a case-by-case basis. And I could talk to folks about what they're wanting and looking for, and we could decide whether or not, I would fit as their primary care doctor, or if they would maybe need a primary care doctor in addition to what I'm offering and doing.
Makes sense. Before we keep going, does anybody have any questions on anything we talked about so far before we dive into Q&A and some additional details? If not, then we can continue and get at sort of what I think everybody wants to know, and it's how can they best leverage the facility and the testing in general to improve health and performance and training and racing. And for the athletes on this call, I think that it's somewhat obvious, and we touched upon some, but when we think about it from a performance perspective, everybody here, it's are endurance athletes, triathletes, and they want to be healthy, live long, and race well. And so through this membership, just personally as a coach, I'm excited to kind of work with athletes, collaborate with them, and then work with them in a more holistic way and sort of partner in a manner that will just allow me to coach better. And that involves understanding what's going on under the hood metabolically. So that's where the VO2 max testing is very important. But it's not just VO2 max testing. It's we do measure aerobic capacity, but we are measuring. So we have a metabolic cart at the lab, and we measure with perfect precision, in real time, how much oxygen you're taking in and using. What is your aerobic threshold? What pace does that occur? What heart rate is that occurring? And we aren't just guessing based on a test. We're looking at what's going on, the air going in and out. We can tell exactly at a given pace or wattage how many grams of carbs one is combusting, how many grams of fat. And again, this isn't like we're testing one thing and kind of extrapolating, like we know. So that's pretty powerful. And the other piece of this is, I think that is going to be interesting, are the blood panels. And I know a few athletes have already started the Fusion membership, and some useful tests that have been done or that will continue to be done are so the DEXA. The DEXA is a great medical device. It's incredible. So it measures body fat and also bone density. And so if one is constantly injured, we can kind of understand the composition. So from an athlete, a high performing athlete, having access to all of this is is amazing. And certainly as a coach, I definitely have insight into things like heart rate and communicating with athletes. It together, we kind of have a fast track to a medical professional in Dr. Jake, and we have access to an entire lab. But kind of moving on maybe into the nitty gritty and getting into some of the questions that athletes asked, specifically maybe on the blood panel side. So why are blood panels important, and how often should an athlete get a blood panel? And I guess how does one get a blood panel through Transformation?
Yeah, so our labs, our blood panel labs are done through LabCorp. So I just place the order, and the athletes would make an appointment at LabCorp, go for their blood draw. Most of our tests are done fasting. And I think it really depends when you're talking about how frequently. I think especially if you've never had any of these things checked, checking them once and just kind of figuring out where you're at, and if there are things that you're trying to address or change. But if everything's really already, kind of in a optimal range, and other things are not changing, the way you're feeling is not changing, you haven't made drastic changes to your nutrition or training, then you may not need to recheck some of those things for as long as a year. Some things maybe even longer than that. But if there are things that we're actively trying to address and change, we've implemented interventions to try to move the needle on something, we're going to want to follow that up pretty quickly and recheck those things to see if what we're doing is having any impact. So we're talking 3 to 6 months, depending on what it is, and how quickly we expect it to change. So, and then, we're talking about screening for diseases that affect, everybody, the general population: heart disease, metabolic disease, and then also things that, maybe more specific to athletes. So looking at the kidney function, and looking for screening for anemia and maybe some nutritional deficiencies. So are these things, mandatory? Probably not, but probably a good idea to at least assess where you're at some point, and just know if there are things that can be optimized.
Yeah, I know that, anemia, iron levels, that's something that many endurance athletes need to pay attention to. I know one pro athlete who I work with a couple of months ago, did a race, and then afterwards was, a week and a half later, just wasn't recovering from it, just was not executing workouts well, and nothing made sense because the load wasn't high, and there was nothing out of the ordinary. But he was trying out sort of a vegetarian diet, and we decided to go and get a blood test done, and his ferritin levels were very, very low. So he needed to supplement with some iron, and literally in a week and a half, it was like night and day. He could barely complete a workout, and then a week and a half later, fix the problem, and boom, was crushing basically all-time high numbers. So that type of thing, I guess, is helpful. I mean, it can be powerful seeing what's going on with a blood test. And what else can a blood test reveal that maybe an endurance athlete can use? If we're thinking about maximizing performance, these athletes are training a lot, they're sweating a lot, pretty much everybody's training 10 to 20 hours a week. What are some other interesting insights we can use, maybe even supplements that we can integrate if that's relevant?
Certainly. We can check electrolyte levels, some of the most important electrolyte levels, when we're checking the kidney function, make sure that whatever repletion protocols people are using are getting them or keeping them in an appropriate range. We're checking iron levels and B12 levels, which can be low in endurance athletes, making sure blood counts are all normal. We can assess thyroid function. We can assess adrenal function in some capacity, making sure that endurance events aren't causing any lasting impact on the kidney. We can see some acute decrease in renal function after a race, but making sure that that isn't kind of accruing over time and causing anything that we need to be concerned about. Those are probably the big things I think about on the blood panel side, that are maybe more specific to endurance athletes.
Sure. And then what about things like vitamin D and omega-3? I mean, can those things show up on blood tests?
Yeah, so I check a vitamin D level on everybody at this latitude. I know your athletes probably spend quite a bit of time outside training, but even still, it's really hard to get enough vitamin D just from sun exposure at this latitude. So almost everybody could benefit from some supplementation. And we can really kind of target your dose by checking your levels. So that's part of my standard blood panel is a vitamin D level. And I also like to target a level a little bit higher than is generally recommended. So I like to see a level at least 50. Kind of more conventional models don't really recommend supplementing as long as it's above 30, which is really scraping the bottom of the bucket. Omega-3 levels we can check with the finger prick test that we mail off, and can recommend supplementation with fish oils, especially if athletes don't really get any fatty fish in their diet. That's one that's got some pretty well-known benefits for just about everybody. So.
Sure. Great. And then another question from the that an athlete asked on Slack: are there any supplements you recommend for the majority of athletes or common deficiencies? Any myth-busting supplements to stay away from?
I couldn't really think of any that I thought were just, overblown and should be avoided at all costs. Most supplements don't have great data to support their use for a lot of reasons. But just lack of evidence is not evidence of lack. So there are instances where, I think the face validity is high, meaning it makes enough sense to me that supplementing this to be in the appropriate level would be of benefit, and the harm is low enough that I think even without hard, evidence that it with a proven benefit, I think it makes sense to do it anyways. But yeah, so it's hard to. There's lots of supplements out there. Most of them don't have evidence, but the ones I think that are good for really just about anybody: vitamin D, usually in the form of vitamin D3, and then vitamin K2. Almost nobody gets vitamin K2 in their diet, unless they're eating like organ meats or a ton of fermented foods, which most of us are not. And vitamin K2 has implications for both bone health, which is a concern for endurance athletes, and cardiovascular health. So I think that's an important one to be supplementing. And then again, fish oils, again, unless athletes are eating a few servings of fatty fish a week, probably a good idea to maybe just include a fish oil in their supplementation. And then making sure we're getting enough zinc and magnesium. Those are super important minerals that can sometimes be deficient in diet. I suspect most of your athletes are probably getting a fair amount, but if we are eating vegetarian, there's a decent chance you could be missing some zinc. So.
Makes sense. Is there a specific brand of fish oil that you're a fan of, or any?
I really like the Nordic Naturals brand.
Got
High quality. So
yeah, that's what we take. And it's good.
We've had movement, Conrad, on those with Nordic Naturals, and Carlson was the other one that at least we've seen changes on the omega-3 index readings with. So I mean, those are okay. I'm sure there are others, but those two are ones that we've actually seen a protocol improve scores on. So that's encouraging.
Nice. Well, it's definitely a luxury, and to actually have the ability to track all this and see it and test for ourselves rather than reading, some anecdotes online or an Amazon review or something. It moves the needle. So that's amazing. Does anybody have any questions on any of the other questions we just talked about before we move on?
I had one question on back on the LabCorp. Is that a separate fee from your fees than when you go to the lab to have your blood?
Most all labs, blood panel labs, all of my comprehensive labs, and when we recheck those are all included in the membership cost. There may be a few specialty labs if we find some reason that we need to do some of these specialty labs, like send out genetic testing or these kind of big extensive GI panels. There may be some additional costs for those, but most of these things that we've talked about so far are all included.
What test do you do for renal function?
I do what's called a basic metabolic panel. So that's a creatinine, a BUN, and then some of the.
But the creatinine can be artificially off just from exercise and stuff. There's another test for renal function that's more specific, right?
Yes. So I also include a cystatin C. Which,
so that is included?
It is.
Okay.
So yeah, that allows us to use a more detailed formula to calculate your renal function. That's less prone to artifact from creatine supplementation or acute changes based on hydration status.
Thanks.
Any other questions before we keep going? So another question somebody asked, do you recommend seeing a professional who works specifically with athletes for blood work, etc.? I've had some tests done with my local physician, but was told that sometimes for endurance athletes, there are different ranges that are considered normal for certain metrics that a regular lab may not be concerned about. How true is that? Maybe that goes back to the vitamin D question.
Yeah, so I think it is true that just the reference ranges don't always mean that something is optimized. So just because you fall in the range of okay for the lab that's performing the test doesn't necessarily mean that that value is as good as we can get it or would like it to be. So that is true. So I wouldn't say that I'm a physician who specializes in working with athletes, specifically, especially endurance athletes. But I do think I'm a physician who understands that your goals may be different than just the average patient coming into the primary care doctor's office, and that good enough is not necessarily what you're looking for. And I think that's probably what's most important. Conrad, you're the endurance specialist. Kurt's the exercise physiologist. So I don't know that I necessarily have to be a specialist in endurance athletes, but I do think it's important, especially when you're really trying to optimize things, to have a physician that at least understands and appreciates your goals and what you're looking for, trying to achieve.
Mm-hmm. And then this question I think is a good one, and we could probably talk about it for a long time, but somebody on Slack asked, are there long-term concerns for the volume of pizza and Gatorade it takes to power an 8-hour training day? Are we accumulating any risk for CVD or diabetes? How would we know if we were fit and lean but had underlying health issues?
That's a good question. So I think that in short, I would say no. If you as an individual have some predisposition to high cholesterol levels and cardiovascular disease, the saturated fat content of your pizza might not be the best choice. There may be better ways to fuel your training than that. But beyond that, really, I think the biggest thing is energy balance. And so you guys are using that fuel that you're taking in to support those workouts. So I don't think it's really conferring diabetes risk. You're sweating out that salt load. You're repleting it with all the salt in that pizza, and then the electrolytes in the Gatorade. So I think when it's used for that purpose, I wouldn't be overtly concerned about that. But, you know, there are folks who look pretty lean on the outside, but can have some visceral fat that can cause some metabolic dysfunction. And the DEXA can show us that. We can do tests for early signs of insulin resistance, things that start long before, you know, we see problems with an A1C or anything like that. And then we're doing lipid panels and kind of extended lipid panels. So looking for additional risk factors just beyond the kind of the traditional total cholesterol, LDL cholesterol. And those are all things that folks, if they've never had any of those things checked, should at least know kind of where they're at right now.
That is helpful, because it's funny, because it seems like they're just like with whatever shoe type is in vogue, so too is you know, diets kind of go through cycles. And you know, a few years ago maybe there was more of an emphasis on, or maybe even recently, or just this emphasis on lower carb. And perhaps there are applications of training a little bit glycogen depleted to incite certain adaptations, but I think that most we're landing around the idea that, you know, you need to be fueling with carbs. Bad things can happen if you're depriving your body of carbs and you are an endurance athlete. But it's definitely an interesting question, and I'm sure that, you know, there are many directions to take it, like ketone esters and other weird exotic sort of diet things, but that might be for another webinar. But moving on, somebody asked, the majority of us know we probably don't sleep enough. Are there any compensations for less than 7 hours of sleep, or recommendations on sleep aids such as melatonin to boost recovery in the smaller sleep window?
You know, I think every person's number that they require in terms of hours of sleep can vary a little bit. I know folks may have heard of Matthew Walker, the kind of the sleep scientist out of Stanford, I think, who's done a lot of studies around kind of the 7 to 8 hours and really touts that number. But that's not the right number for everybody. Some people are fine with less. Some people need more. So I think the main thing is sort of figuring out what you need, what helps you be rested and recovered. And then we really have to prioritize getting that as often as you can, because there is no like cheat code for chronic sleep deprivation. Unfortunately, it's a super important factor of health. It can cause all kinds of other, or feed into all other sorts of dysfunction. So in the long term, kind of on average, I think you just need to figure out kind of what's your number that helps you feel rested and recovered, and try to set up good sleep hygiene, good schedules that allow you to hit that number as often as possible, or most of the time. In instances where, you know, that's not possible, you know, nothing's ever perfect. We can't always get as much sleep as we need. Melatonin actually hasn't been shown to help you stay asleep or improve quality of sleep. There is some data that shows that it does help people fall asleep, but not stay asleep or improve quality of sleep. And then there's maybe some concerns about using it chronically every day, long term. I don't know that the data for that is firm, but it would make sense. You know, the dose that our brains produce is minuscule compared to the amount that's in the supplements that people are taking over the counter. So they're kind of mega doses compared to what our body sees physiologically. So if you're exposing yourself to that all the time, could you be creating more problems than you're helping? It's possible. We don't know that for sure. But things that I think you can do on days when maybe you haven't gotten as much rest as you would have liked or needed. There's this thing called non-sleep deep rest. Andrew Huberman talks a lot about it. If any of y'all listen to Huberman, but it's short periods of kind of deep relaxation where you don't actually fall asleep, or the goal is not to fall asleep, but are actually really restorative, particularly for mental clarity. but also I think probably can have some impact on physical aspects as well. And then if folks are looking for a supplement to help on nights when they really need something to help with sleep, one called phosphatidylserine is gaining some traction for helping both with falling asleep, staying asleep, and improving sleep quality. Again, like I said earlier, most supplements don't have great data to support their use. And so same here, we don't have firm data to show that this helps, but it's been kind of gaining some popularity recently. We don't know how it does that, but it seems to be generally pretty safe. So maybe worth a try.
Interesting. What was the name of that again?
Phosphatidylserine.
Okay. I'll butcher the spelling when I Google it later, but
I'll type it in the chat here.
Sounds good. Very cool. And then moving on to the next question, which is about sodium bicarbonate. Somebody asked, I remember learning how effective sodium bicarbonate could be in my exercise physiology class over 10 years ago in college to buffer acid accumulation in the muscles. Only issue was that it would inevitably upset stomachs. Brands now are claiming to have figured out how to deliver sodium bicarbonate without the upset stomach. Do they really work? That is, make high doses of sodium bicarbonate tolerable and still deliver the benefit?
So what they're talking about is enteric coated sodium bicarbonate, and that does exist. There are brands that make that, which means your body doesn't start absorbing the bicarbonate, or the bicarbonate is not released until it makes it through the stomach and into the intestines, which means that bicarbonate is not mixing with your stomach acid and creating carbon dioxide, which is generally what causes the stomach upset. So that does exist. Whether or not it helps from the acid buffering perspective and performance, I don't really have any experience with that. Conrad or Kurt, I don't know if you guys can speak to that part of it.
Yeah, I think I would consider a lot. I mean, with supplements, it's always a risk reward proposition. So when you think about sodium bicarbonate and why you might be taking it, I mean, the big piece of that is ultimately in these periods of energy system demand where anaerobic glycolysis is the biggest driver of our energy production. So we're thinking efforts that might be, 30 seconds all the way up to, 10 minutes or so. That's where you're going to see the biggest effect of sodium bicarbonate, because ultimately that's when we're producing a lot more hydrogen ions as a byproduct, and the muscle's getting more acidic. And so we take the sodium bicarbonate to kind of buffer against that and restore the pH of the muscle. So to me, I would say, well, if I'm, maybe racing in a 5K and trying to get every possible advantage, then maybe I would consider playing around with that and seeing, what my stomach could handle, and if any of these other forms would suffice for that. But if I'm running an Ironman or something that's even an Olympic distance try, I'm looking at the research and saying, hey, the reward may not be that great given the energy systems that are utilized. So I think that's really important to consider no matter what supplement we're taking, but particularly in this case.
Yeah, I think I am very suspicious that it's useful for long course athletes or anything, like you're saying, anything over a few minutes. I know that a few athletes have tried the Morton bicarb system, and I think mostly the benefit is probably placebo. But the thing to remember is that when you take the product, you're ingesting massive amounts of sodium. I think like seven grams of sodium. So that's a substantial, I mean, 70,000 milligrams, if you think about it like that. And a scoop of Tailwind has about 350 milligrams. So it might actually, you might be oversalting yourself, and that could lead to other issues. But I remember when I was in college, I read Tim Noakes, The Lore of Running, and he talked about, back in the day, I mean, in like the 70s, athletes were experimenting with baking soda, and I did an experiment on myself one practice, and I just remember it did not go well. I was just so thirsty. My stomach did not feel good, and I never did it again. So anyway, you can decide whether or not you want to try Morton's bicarb system, but I think it ends up being like $30 per serving, which is, a lot to spend for something that doesn't really have a lot of controlled studies supporting the use for longer distance racing. And Seth just posted a good question in the Slack. He said, the pizza question kind of let us off the hook for eating unhealthy foods, as long as we're compensating for them with our training. Any foods that we should still consider avoiding, i.e., reading a lot about the potential long-term harms of ultra-processed foods?
Yeah, again, there are maybe specific reasons why some people might want to avoid diets that are high in saturated fat. If they have issues with their cholesterol and cardiovascular disease. Ultimately, I think the biggest issue with highly or ultra processed foods, which in general should be kind of minimized in our diet, is that those foods are extremely nutrient dense. And so our population as a whole is eating a lot of these extremely nutrient dense foods, or calorically dense, but micronutriently not very dense foods. And it's contributing largely to the obesity epidemic because of the energy imbalance. Those foods also have a lot of salt in them. There's a lot of talk about seed oils now. I think the main issue with seed oils is probably just that they're imbalanced. Omega-6s are an important part of our diet. They're essential fatty acids as well. But now that they're in every packaged food that we eat, we're getting massive doses of them. And most of us aren't eating that much fatty fish or getting good omega-3 sources to kind of balance that out. And so I think that's the issue with that. So in short, if your goal is to optimize your health and, live as well and as long as possible, yeah, you should definitely be prioritizing whole foods as much as possible. It may be hard to get enough calories and things like that in to eating whole foods like that to fuel your race. I don't know. But so I don't think it's that you can never eat pizza. But I don't know that I'd be eating pizza every day, sort of thing. So it matters, but I don't know that you have to avoid it at all costs or be afraid of it.
Definitely. I know Alex, my wife, she calls them hyper palatable foods, where it's easy just to eat a lot of it. And that's why, I like chips, and I think it's better for me to get like the individual little bags of chips for lunch, because I'll just like have a sandwich and then all of a sudden eat half a bag of Kettle salt and vinegar chips, and without even realizing it. And it's like the Pringles motto: once you pop, you can't stop.
Yeah, that's intentional.
Yes.
So.
And then next question, somebody asked, what are the regular body/recovery metrics athletes should value the most and that are available via normal tracking devices or apps? Any other metrics worth tracking on a less frequent basis?
Kurt, you want to take that one?
Yeah, that's a good one. I think certainly on a less frequent basis, the stuff that we do in the physiology lab is important stuff. Body composition, keeping an eye on aerobic capacity and changes in thresholds. But I think on the normal tracking devices and apps, the two, and they're pretty common metrics, but I think people don't utilize them properly most of the time, would be keeping an eye and a consistent trend on both your resting heart rate and then your heart rate variability. And please, when you do these, put your strap on, put your chest strap on. Don't rely on your optical sensor to make those measurements, but put your chest strap on. You can use like a free service like Elite HRV if you want to, just to support that, or you can use your built-in through Garmin or Apple or whatever platform you're utilizing for that. But with those, before you do anything with them, you need to accumulate a minimum of 6 weeks worth of data points on those, and then you can start from there. Once you have about 6 weeks worth of measurements done consistently on a daily basis, you can start to peek at the trends a little bit, and use that for evaluation. And some of that can be looking at recovery pieces. Other that is autonomic nervous system function. So are we more in a shifted a little more to a sympathetic state or more of a parasympathetic state that particular day? So those two would be the ones I would keep an eye on, but I would have a robust data set before I start making any day-to-day adjustments or alterations, because again, I think you can get in the weeds with day-to-day training decisions on those. And we use those, but we also use it alongside this piece called DC potential, which is a central nervous system evaluation essentially, but that's not available to most people. So you can get it done with the others. You just have to have a little more data, because you don't have that overarching piece to take a look at.
And will that be available at the lab, the robust one that you just mentioned?
Yeah, we're working on a partnership with Omega Wave. It's actually stuff you could take home and utilize. So I mean, it's really just an electrode cable that you run from your with a couple sensors that you run from your hand up to your forehead. So it's not very it's not like you have to come into the lab to do that measurement necessarily. It can be done from anywhere, but we're working on a partnership with them where we could offer it out to more people. But honestly, you can get a lot just as long as you're consistent with your measurements on resting heart rate and HRV.
And then somebody asked, as athletes age, do testing protocols change? And should supplements or diet change with age to mitigate things like muscle loss or joint health?
Yeah, in terms of testing protocols, like Physiology Lab protocols don't really change themselves. I mean, they're mainly based on your performance level, but certainly the second part, I mean, we have to consider all the facets of aging, which is decreased resting metabolic rate, generally a loss of muscle mass. Keep an eye on bone density, especially for female athletes. So yeah, all those pieces will play into that without a doubt. But as far as the protocols themselves, not a whole lot of shift there. It's mostly just based off of your performance level and the type of data that we're looking to pull. But the data may change, but the protocols don't, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. And then the last question, most primary care has an annual checkup and visits when you get sick. How does the model of at Transformation Labs differ? For example, what should athletes expect in terms of how to maintain health/wellness in collaboration with a doctor versus calling when you're sick or seeing them once a year? I know we covered much of that, but I don't know if Jake, you wanted to give a precise answer to that one.
Yeah, I see this sort of as a completely different paradigm. The idea behind this is being really proactive and preventative. So looking for issues before they're issues or when they're still small, which is not typically done in the primary care office just because insurance doesn't reimburse for those things. And those doctors are really busy, strapped for time, and they're trying to move as quickly as they can. This model sort of allows me to spend as long as I need with folks and really kind of dive into what's better than good enough. How do we optimize what we have in front of us? So just the kind of a different approach, a different goal, different mindset. It's also pretty holistic. So in addition to these labs, I'm sort of, I'm doing kind of more comprehensive, more extended lab testing than you typically get from your primary care doctor's office in terms of looking at lipids and cardiovascular health, looking for earlier stages of metabolic dysfunction, looking for more detailed assessments of the renal function, as your one athlete asked about. So sort of more thorough, in-depth blood panels, but then we're also have the benefit of having the physiology and body composition testing from Kurt that we get to layer on top of those things. And again, can really spend the time to kind of dive into lifestyle factors. You're not just checking off whether or not you smoke and how many drinks of alcohol you have a week on a form that, the receptionist hands you, and then no one's going to talk to you about that again. Like we're going to talk about how you're sleeping, what your stress levels are like, how you use various different substances, and how you think those things impact you. So it's really a more holistic approach. We're gathering sort of as much data about each individual kind of as a whole person as possible, and using that information to drive what we're doing. Very personal. Again, our members have direct access to me. They can text me, email me, call me. They don't have to go through a receptionist or the nurse or anything. They just, we can hop on a call if we need a more formal touch point, or if you just have a quick question or concern or want to update me, you can text me, shoot me an email. And then what I think is really great about this partnership is the team-based approach. We can collaborate with you, their coach, and with Kurt, exercise physiologist, and me, and really, build a whole plan around the athletes and what we're doing. And I think time and again, we've shown that multidisciplinary teams do a better job at taking care of people than, individuals kind of acting in isolation or in silos. But unfortunately, it's hard the medical system has not supported that model very well. So.
Yeah, that's helpful. And I think I'll try to give a terse answer on really how I think the athletes I work with can leverage this in the best way, sort of leverage the lab and the partnership. And I think if you think about it in terms of 3 pillars, which is nutrition, recovery, and performance, I think the lab is going to be helpful for nailing all 3 of those. So, number 1, nutrition / body composition. Having good body composition and good nutrition is essential for being as fast as you possibly can. If we're going to just get down to the nitty-gritty, everybody wants to crush their PRs, and having good body comp is essential for that. And to achieve good body comp, that means being strong, that means having muscle mass, that means having an appropriate level of body fat, that not too high but also not too low. Oftentimes we see athletes being too low too. So through the lab, we can test that. And then we can also test your resting metabolic rate. So, separate from, the calories you're burning from exercise, what is your basal metabolic rate? Because that varies tremendously between people. And then if you know that, you can kind of dial in how many calories you should be consuming each day. Maybe you track for a week, maybe you track every day, whatever is best for you. So doing the test, like the body comp test and the RMR, it's beneficial for dialing that in. The recovery piece is important. I think that relates to probably working directly with you, Jake, and talking about things like sleep and habits there and things like that. And then the last pillar is the performance pillar. And when I think about that, if we're talking about literal active performance, that's where the VO2 max testing / the metabolic testing comes into play, where we identify exactly what your fitness is right now and what substrate you're burning, so that we can develop at different intensities, so that we can develop a good fueling strategy. Because not everybody needs to be, guzzling 1.5 liters of fluid with 100 or 120 grams of carbs during an Ironman. That could backfire for a lot of athletes. Maybe you don't need that many, but with the metabolic cart or inside testing, it's a very precise way. And then, like Kurt said, we have a Moxie, which measures oxygen saturation in the capillaries, and that's sort of cutting edge. That's even beyond lactate testing. So the idea is for athletes to tighten all of like those 3 dimensions, or support those pillars by leveraging the testing services available. Does anybody have any questions on anything that we talked about, or anything related to a performance lab or testing or anything? Nope. Well, if not, feel free to send over any questions after the fact, or I know a lot of people are going to watch the recording here. Feel free to email me directly, or could certainly reach out to Kurt. How can, or Dr. Jake, how can they contact you guys? How can the athletes contact you?
Yeah, we'll drop our emails into the chat here, so you guys can reach out if you have any questions. I always like to leave with like one really solid resource for people to look into too, if they want to dig a little bit deeper. And admittedly, I'm a little biased because I'm part of the organization, but the position stands that are written by the ISSN, in my opinion, are some of the best tools to familiarize yourself when it comes to performance nutrition. I'll put one in the chat here that was related to sodium bicarbonate, since we talked about that earlier, but they have them on a whole host of topics. And, within the ISSN, it's really like a who's who of physiology and nutrition researchers kind of coming together at the intersection of these 2 fields. And so I would spend a little bit of time like looking through those. There's some for exercise recovery and kind of general things like protein function and intake, and just a variety of topics covered. And they are some of the most well thought out. There's a lot of time and energy that goes into not only sifting through the research to determine what gets included, but then analyzing that research and coming to a summary of outcomes based off of what's available right now. So I'm going to put the link to one of those in there, and you guys can certainly follow up with many others. In addition to that, there's a lot of great resources there.
Awesome. So that I won't exit the meeting immediately. The athletes can snag that link, and I'll paste the link into where we store our webinars on the Working Triathlete website as well. So if you'd like to get in touch with Jake or Kurt, it's jake@transformation.com. That's a 1 and a 0 for the I and the O in transformation. And then Kurt is kurt@transformation.com. Cool. So, well, thanks for joining, everybody. Does anybody have any closing comments or questions? Cool. I know Kat, she just messaged. I've worked with them through this membership and they've been great. So that's good.
Yeah, they've been stellar.
Good. And yeah, the insights that we've gained, we've applied to training, and I know that we're going to get you into the lab again for a cycling test, VO2 max threshold test. So that's coming up right before you do Ironman Arizona. This is the time to capture that data for the last time, so that you can really train well over the last couple of months. But great. Well, thanks for hopping on, everybody. And again, don't hesitate to reach out with questions. But everybody have a good night, and we will chat with you later.
Thanks, Conrad.
Thanks,
Thanks,
y'all.
Joe.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.